Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into a really difficult story. The death of U.S. Army soldier LaVena Johnson.
Yeah, it's a case that sticks with you. Officially, her death in Iraq was ruled a suicide.
But that's just the start. Her family saw evidence, compelling evidence really, that pointed towards foul play, and they haven't stopped asking questions since.
Exactly. So our mission today, you could say, is to unpack all these different sources of information.
Right. We've got the official Army narrative on one side.
And the family's persisting questions, backed by some pretty stark physical evidence, on the other. Plus, various investigations that came later.
It's a complex picture.
It really is. Different pieces seem to point in completely different directions sometimes. It forces you to really look hard at each detail, doesn't it?
Definitely. So to get a handle on this, let's start with LaVena herself. Who was she before all this?
Well, she was born July 27, 1985. Grew up in Florissant, Missouri, daughter of John and Linda Johnson.
And after high school, Hazelwood Central, she joined the Army. That was September 15, 2004, ready to serve.
And she was deployed to Balad, Iraq. But tragically, she wasn't there long at all.
How long?
Just 8 weeks. She died on July 19, 2005. Just 8 days before she would have turned 20.
Wow. 8 days. That's heartbreaking.
It is, and the initial word from the Department of Defense was swift. Suicide.
A devastating finding for any family. But for her father, John Johnson, himself a veteran.
Yeah, for him, something felt wrong from the moment he saw her body. At the funeral home. That was the turning point. He started his own investigation, essentially.
And the Army wasn't exactly forthcoming at first, were they?
No, not really. Information only started coming out through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA.
And that was only after Representative William Lacey Clay Jr. started asking questions, right, during those hearings about Pat Tillman's death.
Exactly. Which raises a big question right away. Why the reluctance? Why did it take congressional pressure to get basic information released to a grieving family?
It definitely sets a certain tone. And what the family did eventually find, well, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, the autopsy report, the photos, they showed things that seemed, let's say, inconsistent with the official suicide story.
Like what specifically?
Well, LaVena had injuries. A broken nose, a black eye, loose teeth. Things you don't typically associate with a self-inflicted gunshot.
Okay, that's already raising major flags.
And then there's probably the most disturbing piece of evidence. Burns. From some kind of corrosive chemical found on her genitals.
Burns? What?
Several reporters who looked into this suspected it was an attempt to destroy DNA evidence, pointing very strongly towards a sexual assault before her death.
That completely changes the narrative. That's not suicide.
Not in any straightforward way, no.
Yeah.
And it makes the official finding much harder to accept for the family, obviously.
And there was more, wasn't there? The gunshot wound itself.
Right. The wound was to her mouth, which, again, to the family and others looking at the case, didn't seem consistent with how most firearm suicides occur.
Okay, so broken nose, black eye, loose teeth, chemical burns suggesting assault, an atypical gunshot wound.
And one more thing. Bloody footprints discovered outside her living quarters.
Footprints. Whose? Were they ever identified?
That's part of the mystery. But their presence just adds another layer, another reason to suspect someone else was involved.
So you put all that together. It's a stark contrast to the official ruling.
Absolutely. It transforms it from what the Army called a clear suicide into this really complex, deeply troubling mystery. The physical evidence just seems to scream something else happened.
Understandably, this started to get attention. People started talking.
Yeah, by June 2008, you had a spokesman for the House Armed Services Committee saying they were, looking into her death, though they stopped short of promising a formal investigation at that point.
But the Army held its ground.
They did. Christopher Gray, who is the Chief of Public Affairs for the Army's Criminal Investigative Command, CID, basically said, nope, from our perspective, this case is closed.
Wow. Even with all that evidence.
Even then. Which of course fueled the public response.
Tell me about that. What happened publicly?
Well, after a local news report, KMOV, aired a story in February 2007, things really picked up steam. An online petition was launched.
To Congress?
Yes, to the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, asking them to step in. And it got a lot of traction, over 37,000 signatures.
That's significant support.
It was. And then an official website for LaVena Johnson went up, pushing for a new Army investigation, keeping the pressure on.
Were there other groups involved?
Yes. In July 2008, Color of Change, the online black activist group, started its own petition.
What was their goal?
They called on Henry Waxman, who chaired the House Oversight Committee at the time, to hold a hearing. Not just on LaVena's death, but on how the Army handled her case, and importantly, others like it. So, looking at a potential systemic issue.
So the pressure was building from multiple directions. Did it lead to any independent reviews?
It did, and this is a really interesting part of the story. On July 19, 2011, the anniversary of her death, actually,
Wow.
criminal justice students from the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute, the CCIRI, picked up her case.
CCRI, that's a student group.
Yeah, a club run by 3 universities. They take on cold cases, and they decided to investigate LaVena's death.
What was their plan? How did they approach it?
Their main goal was to do a crime scene reconstruction, to try and see if re-examining the physical layout and evidence could offer new insights.
That sounds thorough.
They were certainly dedicated. Cheryl McCollum from CCRI called the case gut-wrenching. She said they spent 3 years on it.
3 years? That's much longer than usual for them, right?
Yeah, apparently they normally dedicate about a year to a case. So this shows how seriously they took it.
Okay, so after 3 years of work, crime scene reconstruction, what did this independent group conclude?
Well, this is where it gets complicated again, and maybe frustrating for those seeking a different outcome.
So,
McCollum stated that while they faulted the Army for, quote, poor communication and the lack of information given to that family fast enough.
which echoes the family's early experiences.
Exactly. But crucially, she also said the CCIRI did not disagree with the Army's final conclusion.
They agreed it was suicide.
Essentially, yes. McCollum said, quote, there was nothing about this case that we could go back to the Army to say you need to relook at it. And also, we didn't have anything new. We didn't have anything that suggested wrongdoing.
Wait, after 3 years, they found nothing new. Nothing suggesting foul play, despite the broken nose, the burns, the footprints.
That's what the report concluded. It's a really pivotal moment. You have this independent body, students guided by professionals, spending years on it. And they ultimately back the Army's finding while still criticizing their communication.
How do you even square that circle? The initial evidence seemed so strong.
It's tough. It really challenges what we think of as definitive proof or a closed case. Does the lack of new evidence invalidate the questions raised by the initial evidence? It's a difficult question.
So, did things quiet down after the CCRI report?
Not entirely. The fight continued, just maybe shifted focus a bit. Around 2016, an attorney named Donald V. Watkins started publicly pointing fingers. He named a specific individual, Kevin P. Burns, as a leading suspect in LaVena's death.
Based on what? Was that ever made clear?
The specifics of his reasoning weren't fully laid out in widely available sources, but he was vocal about it.
And is he still involved?
He is, actually. Very recently, as of August 2023, Watkins, who had his own legal issues and was released from prison, is reportedly working with the Johnson family again.
On what?
On a new film about LaVena. So, nearly 2 decades later, the family is still actively seeking answers, still trying to tell her story and get what they see as justice.
That persistence is incredible.
It really is. And if you step back and look at the bigger picture, these ongoing efforts by the family, by allies like Watkins, it just highlights this deep, fundamental need for transparency and accountability from the military.
Especially when it involves the death of a soldier under questionable circumstances.
Exactly. It shows how official findings don't always bring closure, especially when there are lingering doubts and inconsistencies. The search for truth can become a lifelong mission for families.
So, recapping this incredibly complex and tragic case, LaVena Johnson's death ruled a suicide by the Army.
But questioned intensely by her family due to really disturbing forensic evidence. The injuries, the burns, the footprints.
Followed by years of advocacy, public pressure, and eventually an independent investigation by the CCIRI.
Which, while criticizing the Army's handling, ultimately agreed with the suicide conclusion, finding no new evidence of foul play.
Yet the family's fight continues even now, with new efforts to bring her story to light.
It leaves us in a difficult place, doesn't it? It really makes you think about the power of a family's conviction, their search for justice against an official narrative.
And how conflicting information like the initial evidence versus the CCIRI findings can make it almost impossible to feel like there's a truly definitive conclusion.
Absolutely. It raises a fundamental question. What does it actually take for a case like this to be considered truly closed? Not just stamped closed in a file, but closed in a way that satisfies the need for truth, especially when the initial facts seem so contradictory. Something for all of us to think about.